Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the God Squad Pod. I am your host, one of the hosts anyway. We still got music, hold on.
I don't know why we have music going, but there we go.
Okay. That music is so good, we just wanted to keep it going for a minute. But our guest tonight is even better. But I'm Dillon, Naber, Cruz, the tattooed theologian, joined by the Desimber Rose. And tonight it is my distinct privilege and honor to welcome to the show my friend and formerly my New Testament and Biblical Interpretation professor at Lancaster Theological Seminary, Dr. Greg Carey. Greg, welcome to the God Squad Pod, and thank you for joining us.
I am so happy to be here. Happy to meet you, Desimber, also. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So yeah, I wanted to give that full disclosure because, every once in a while, Greg and I get together for a beer. We talk about biblical stuff and politics stuff and Christian nationalist stuff and just life stuff sometimes. But tonight, we're going to talk about Greg's brand new book, and I'm going to pull this up so everybody can see it. Rereading Revelation, Theology, Ethics, and Resistance. And as he says in the book, Revelation is a queer book, and that's why we need books like Rereading Revelation. I don't know about y'all, but growing up, Revelation was like the boogeyman book. I didn't want to read it. I didn't want to know about it. It scared me, because I heard, how Lindsay's predictions on the news and whatnot and all that kind of stuff. But fortunately, biblical scholars like Greg exist out there to kind of debunk that sort of nonsense. So let's just jump right in, Greg, if you don't mind. What kind of book is Revelation? And what are the differences? Because one time in a paper that I wrote on Romans in your class, you said, don't let your theological interpretations jump into your biblical exegesis or something along those lines. In other words, there was a difference between reading it like a biblical scholar and then reading it theologically as a theologian. So what would you say are the distinctions between those two, and how is that important for a book like Revelation?
Yeah. So, when we read the Bible, we're always going to bring our own questions and assumptions to it. There's no dodging that. I'm not trying to act like you can dodge that. And at the same time, for a biblical scholar, the test of whether you're doing it in a serious way is, could you be surprised? In other words, biblical scholarship is about the questions we ask and then the answers we develop by chasing those questions with literary evidence, historical evidence, you name it. That's different than just reading the Bible devotionally, right? Where, very often folks ask God to give them guidance and they read the Bible, and I do that too. But as a scholar, I also have to be able to explain to someone else why I see the text the way I do in language that they can understand just as well.
And what kind of book is Revelation for the people who aren't up on your specific field of study?
So we often call Revelation an apocalypse. The first word of the book in Greek is apocalypsis, which means an uncovering or revealing. But we also have quite a few ancient Jewish and early Christian apocalypses that we can compare Revelation to. One's in the Bible, the second half of the book of Daniel. But we have a series of others, and these are all books that describe a visionary who has this kind of revelatory experience and describes it. And often that experience involves very bizarre symbols, and it often involves political or social conditions that the author is writing to condemn or critique.
Okay. So who is John's audience? Because growing up, I grew up Southern Baptist in North Texas. Right. So that's going to bring a certain hermeneutical choice to the text, which was typically Revelation is predicting things that are happening back, say in the 1980s when I was growing up, or for some certain Christian nationalists now predicting things that are happening, in the 21st century. But who is John's audience?
Yeah. John says he's writing to 7 assemblies or churches of Jesus followers in a province he calls Asia, which the Roman province of Asia would have been in southwestern Turkey. They're located in 7 fairly significant cities in that region. And so you might imagine that there's a small assembly of these little Jesus followers in Thyatira and Laodicea and Sardis and so forth. And he writes directly to them. So the book starts by saying, here's an apocalypse, but it also describes itself as a word of prophecy given as a letter. So it's literally written to them to address their concerns and circumstances.
Okay. So not necessarily writing to people 2,000 years later. We can read in the text who his audience is and who these 7 churches are and stuff like that. How do we get to the point? I'm just going to take a little detour here. How do we get to the point where it's right there in the text who he's reading? But then we have all these, I'll try to be nice. Maybe they have good motives. Maybe they're grifters. I don't know. But all these end times prophets and priests saying that, credit cards and different things that are happening in the Middle East are all signs and portents of what's happening in Revelation and how it speaks to us today. How did we get so crosswise there?
Yeah. There have always been Christians, at least back to like the 4th century, who have thought Revelation was speaking to them. So
Okay.
you mentioned how it's talking to those 7 churches. It also begins and ends by saying these are the things that are about to happen soon. Right. So, I mean, if you're taking Revelation literally, you have to put it in that ancient context. And all serious biblical scholars do. Like, I'm not weird in that
Right.
way. You could run into anybody at any seminary or college who teaches biblical studies, and they can tell you this. The process, I think, has a lot to do with, and I don't want to get too long or nerdy about it, but in the 19th century, we had this movement called Scottish common sense realism. Right, we were learning how to do science, how to build steamboats and cotton gins and whatever technological thing. And we were thinking that text, had meaning that could be mapped out. An Irish Baptist preacher named John Nelson Darby came up with a system for interpreting Revelation, and he saw it as predicting the end of history. And that his movement grew because it got associated with D.L. Moody, a big evangelist then. And eventually it became kind of the default for American evangelism. That's a very short version of a long story. I could only probably know enough to tell you the medium story.
Okay. That's how it ended up in the Schofield Reference Bible too, right?
Absolutely.
A lot of that. Okay.
I mean,
and those are the kinds of things that damage people.
Well, yeah. I mean, and I had a Schofield Reference Bible back in the day.
Yeah.
To get that reading, you gotta imagine that you can pluck verses from different parts of the Bible, like it's a jigsaw puzzle, and you create the picture by putting those pieces together in a way where you make them fit.
Right.
And you also have to imagine that you have some kind of decoder ring that you can spin and figure out what all the symbols in Revelation map onto in your contemporary world. And that's what it takes to do what a C.I. Schofield did, or you mentioned Al Lindsay or Tim LaHaye. They all had their own ways of doing that.
Right.
What
Yeah.
would you, I have a question. What would you say to those who, I'm hearing you, I'm hearing what you're saying. What would you say to those who push back on the notion that Revelation is completely symbolic, and those who, there's many of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of them, who believe that the book of Revelation is completely realistic, predictive, prophetic, and like it's all gonna happen now. As a matter of fact, maybe it happened a couple times and we all missed it. Or recently, apparently, we all missed the
Yeah.
rapture a couple weeks ago. Again, but what would you say to those who believe that Revelation is a predictive book for the future, and those who and preachers who have preached and made quite a living and movement based on it, like Hagee and others like him.
Absolutely.
A lot of the folks who back what Israel is doing right now, who can turn a blind eye to the murders and things that they're doing, and they base that on what they believe is the manifestation of the book of Revelation. What would you have? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, and in real life, I wouldn't get into arguments with people over it, but you have
Yeah.
relatives and I have relatives, and sometimes because I work on Revelation, somebody will catch me reading something about Revelation on a plane, and then I'm trapped, right? So those things happen. So the first thing I would so really what I'm interested in is resourcing people who need to be resourced with another way of thinking rather than arguing somebody out. So the first thing I would say is think about all the times Christians have made that kind of prediction. In the 1840s, it was a farmer preacher named William Miller. People sold their property, sat on a hill all night long. They called it the Great Disappointment. Hal Lindsey sold tens of millions of copies of the late great Planet Earth.
Yeah.
And he published it, I think, in 1969, I think maybe 1970. And he said, look, all of this is going to happen by 1988. He doesn't give the date, but he says within 40 years of 1948. And he kept selling the book way past 1998, right? And he was on TV until he died. So I would start there. Why do we think one particular system is going to be the answer to that question? But then I would go back to where Dillon started. Do you take seriously that this book was written for those little churches or assemblies? Do you take seriously that it was written to address their concerns? Or does the theology that has Revelation really talking through them into the future, does that theology mean that God uses them as sort of pawns for a message that isn't going to be meaningful in its fullness until later? And that seems to me contrary to the way I would think about God and the way I think about most of the Bible. When somebody is set in that opinion, the truth is, I don't think you argue them out of it.
No, there's not much you can do.
No, but you change your mind over time because you're exposed to other ways of reading, and frankly, they just make more sense.
Yeah.
Well, and how many raptures can come and go before you snap out of it? I don't know.
And how many beasts can you have? Is it the Pope? Is it coming with the Soviets? Is it coming with the Chinese? Is it coming with the Arabs? Because in my lifetime, it's been all of it.
It's been all of those.
How many beasts? How many horsemen?
Yeah. Is it going to be AI? Is it going to be your credit card? These are all things that have flourished in the world, Desimber, right?
Yeah. Barcodes. When I was in high school, it was barcodes, and me and one of my friends would have conversations about that's the mark of the beast and all of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So in Revelation, John, almost certainly not John who wrote the gospel.
Correct.
For those who don't know, but I have sometimes called Revelation a fever dream. But I think that sells it short. it's rhetorically and literarily complex.
Yes.
This is not a stupid person, and this is or a person who ate the wrong kind of fungus or something, and then just manically sat down and wrote some stuff down. This is complex stuff, but he, as you point out, asserts his authority very strongly. And what are we to make 2,000 years later of that kind of claim now? And how does that authority that he claims feed into some of the more authoritarian streams of Christianity?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. John's authority works in multiple ways, but it is a kind of authoritarian rhetoric, right? And by authoritarian, it's I got this message straight from God, and I'm telling you what's in it. Verse 3 of the whole book, blessed is the one who hears and does or keeps the words of this prophecy. And then at the end of the book, if you alter it, your name is taken out of the book of life. So that's a high level of authority. My message is true, and your fate depends on obeying it. Every once in a while, John will also, and this is a hard concept for some people, but if you look at authoritarian leaders in the world, they will make claims that put themselves above you, right? But they will also make claims that put themselves alongside you. Mm-hmm. Like, I am speaking for the people. I am one of you. And Revelation makes those moves too. John calls himself a faithful witness. Jesus is a faithful witness. And he's trying to get these followers of Jesus, he says, to be witnesses. That is, to continue holding on to their faith in adverse circumstances. And to do it out loud. He calls himself their brother, their partner in various hardships and struggles. And in all of those ways, these are things we recognize from authoritarians. Mm-hmm. But the trick is, he's doing it because a fundamental part of the book of Revelation is a critique of the Roman Empire and its cultural and economic system. And so he's trying to counter an authoritarian exploitative empire, but he does it by using authoritarian rhetoric. And we find that is scholars who study resistance literatures around the world find that that's incredibly common.
Right.
There's technical language for that. So part of your question, I just rambled for a little while, but part of your question was, what do we do with it?
Right.
And the answer I'm suggesting is, one, we can learn from it. We can examine Revelation and look at the kinds of authoritarian rhetoric that are out there. We can see John countering it in Rome, but we can also see him doing it. And so it's not as simple as just downloading Revelation and saying, oh, this is how we ought to be. But I think the other thing is, I'm speaking from a Christian point of view, we should be challenged by it. And what I mean by that is, think about the moments in the history of Christianity, and I want to say they're mostly rare, where Christians have said, what I'm facing here in the world is falsehood and corruption, and this is the truth, damn it, and we're going to stand in it and oppose the evil that we're facing. And that could mean at risk of our lives. And you can think back with, your historical imagination and think about abolitionists in the 19th century, mm-hmm. civil rights workers in the 20th century. When do you say, anti-apartheid activists, anti-Nazi Christians who, you can go on. And at some point they had to say, this is a question of life and death truth and falsehood, we're going to align on this side and resist.
Mm.
And that is a necessary, what I would say is Revelation's the only book in the New Testament that poses the question that way.
Right.
Are you willing to say, this is true, that's false, and I'm willing to die over it?
I think that Christianity as a whole, especially in the United States, is in a crisis where that concern, where that level of integrity and fortitude for the truth is concerned right now. I believe it's greatly compromised. And I want to read a passage out of your book, chapter 2, that some of our listeners may think sounds familiar for the times that we're in right now. This subchapter is authoritarianism in an egalitarian mode, and it says Revelation balances its authoritarian tone with egalitarian appeals. Modern authoritarian rhetoric often adopts an egalitarian posture. Authoritarian leaders seek to establish a psychological bond with their followers, albeit one in which the leader wields a privileged power wholly unlike the crowd that longs for identification. And then you go and talk more about Viktor Orban and how he did that. But I would say that that's happening real time right now with the current president of the United States, who has a base that is, by and large, a lot of them are under the poverty line and definitely barely into middle class, definitely not millionaire, billionaire class.
No.
But somehow he has found a way to make them feel like he's one of them, although there's nothing about his life that has ever and never will mirror their lives. He has never experienced hunger or struggling to pay a bill or struggling to find childcare or having to choose between medication and groceries or having to balance a checkbook to make sure that you can pay rent or pay your children's tuition. These are not things that he has ever in his life had to encounter and never will encounter, neither him nor his children, but somehow he has made them feel like he is one of them, and he has never been and never will be one of them.
And I think there's a lesson for us who love democracy in that. I heard a political scientist say that it's not that people necessarily like or dislike a politician. It's whether they feel like that politician likes or respects them.
Mm-hmm.
And progressive politicians have a way of not appealing to people at that real level. And we have ways of communicating. We professors are the worst. We get snarky. And that communicates. But it hurts when you're trying to communicate across a line, right? And so what he has done is communicated to people that they are seen by him, not that he's one of them, but that they're seen by him, and that somehow he has their best interests at heart.
Well, and we'll be completely honest about things that are becoming more and more painfully obvious. He is their champion for a number of reasons, because he is in a position of power that validates their isms and schisms.
They'll say, he says what I think.
He says what I think. He feels what I feel. If you want to blame the browns and blacks, he's blaming the browns and blacks. He's into that. If you want to say women are getting out of their place and they belong barefoot, pregnant in the kitchen, if you want to say that people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and my tax money shouldn't be going to feed this and that, whatever you're wanting to say, he's their champion, and for whatever reason. We could say that he hates who they hate or whatever the case is, but it's deeper than that. Like you said, he makes them feel seen, how he makes them feel. Yeah. And apparently that runs deep. And that is what is explained here about the balance between authoritarianism and egalitarianism. There's a lot of syllables and a lot of words, but they're on display right now in these United States.
Did you have something to add to that, Greg?
It had a lot to do with the way this book works. I mean, I was working on these topics for decades, really, and had written about Revelation in different places over all that time. But there's no question that it's shaped by, most of the rewriting and editing happened in 2023 and 2024. And over the past 10 years, I've been reading a lot of political science to go with my biblical studies research. So, yeah.
Well, it's interesting because you show in the book that John is really all or nothing in his thinking, which
Right.
my therapist has worked with me a lot on, because, and so I was like, maybe there's something to that angle of the perception of trauma, or the perception of being harassed, and Christians being persecuted and all that may have led John to that sort of all or nothing thinking. But you contrasted a little bit at one point. I think it's 2 Corinthians, where Paul is talking about, maybe it's okay to eat some food sacrificed to idols, and because we don't want people losing everything they have and not being able to work. It's not like you could just go jump on Indeed or LinkedIn in the ancient Near East and find another job. If you were a stonemason, you were a stonemason. If you were an enslaved person, that's what your gig was. And if you were a sheep herder, you were a sheep herder. There wasn't, so much upward mobility. So I'm just wondering, is there any study into whether or not John was pushing back? Because you say very clearly that this is a Jewish book, essentially. Is there any sense that John was pushing back against some of Paul's rhetoric that might have filtered into him in southwestern Turkey, where you don't have to be Jewish? The law is the kind of things in Galatians and Philippians, etc. You don't really address that particular question in the book, but it just kind of jumped out at me if there was a conversation as such happening there.
I don't know how you would build a case for or against it. So that's why I don't really address it. It's more of a point of comparison that in 1 Corinthians, Paul is like, you're free to eat whatever you want, but think about your neighbor who might be offended. And what's gone unsaid is access to meat in the ancient world. It's expensive in any world, right?
Right.
So ordinary people are getting protein from things like fish paste and legumes. They're not eating steak. They're not eating lamb. Ordinary people most of the time. So there's who has access to that food. The other part is, if you go into an ancient city and you buy meat, or you get it at a festival, it almost always has been offered in a temple to some deity. That's what temples were. You cook animals and grains and offer them to the gods. That's what a temple is in the ancient world. That's what the Jewish temple was. And so, these are followers of Jesus. And John is saying, well, you can't do that, right? You absolutely can't participate in idolatry. And he has other arguments about you can't participate in the whole commercial political trappings of this Roman system either. But you can't worship the Roman gods. And your question, Dillon, was, well, what does that do to the rest of your life if you don't? If you're a stonemason, your stonemasons guild is going to have meetings. They're going to have a patron deity. They're going to have acts of worship and sacrifice. And if you want to get work from the stonemasons, if you want them to bury you when you die, if you want them to look after your family, then you need to be a member of the guild and participate. Right?
Yeah.
We can think about civic organizations in the United States, where if you want to be a part of that organization, there's a Pledge of Allegiance, there's a prayer. Right?
Creed.
Yeah. You could imagine somebody saying, that violates my convictions, and I just can't participate in that group. It's just not life or death to the degree that leaving your family or trade group or social circle would be in the ancient world.
Right. I mean, this conversation about whether or not a stonemason could go be a stonemason underscores one of the things that I think that a lot of people don't recognize about what biblical scholars have to know to become biblical scholars. It's not just reading whatever particular, either the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, or the New Testament, if you're a, scholar of whichever testament. You got to know all this other stuff to contextualize what's in there. And you referenced multiple different classical era philosophers, whether they were Latin or Greek, historians, all kinds of things. So it's always helpful for me, because growing up as a fundamentalist kid who thought he knew the Bible, and then a fundamentalist young adult who thought he knew the Bible, I didn't know any of that stuff.
Yeah.
And those kinds of things, as a public theologian, I try to share as in my limited way that I can, some of that knowledge, and they just, it's like they just can't hear it, because if they do hear it, it might it might tug on a piece of string that may unravel the whole sweater, kind of thing, But it's fascinating to me, as somebody who studied history academically, to learn more and more about the cultural situation of what's happening, and what maybe made John think, look, no, this is absolute. And he's claimed his authority at the very beginning. He's like, this is coming straight from God. And we know how dangerous that line of thought can be.
Absolutely.
Which begs the question, so then what do we do with Revelation now? The word rapture is never mentioned in it.
No.
But the rapture people, believers, look to it. But it does. What does it speak to eschatology, for example, for ultimate things or in things?
Yeah, Revelation, eschatology, big, you use the big word, right? 11 letters, big word. Has to do with what's ultimately real, whether in the cosmos, like is there a heaven with God up there, or in the course of history, what's truly real, what's behind death, beyond death. Revelation doesn't put out a timeline, but it does put out some images.
Mm-hmm.
So in Revelation, there's a hope for a resurrection where all the people of God are raised, and they don't go to heaven.
Right. That's news to a lot of people.
There's one group that goes to heaven, and that's martyrs who wait in heaven. It's often overlooked, but Revelation mentions them. Everybody else, you're dead until this resurrection. And what happens is, rather than people going to heaven, a new Jerusalem comes from heaven to earth. And it's this massive, glorious city with fresh water and fresh fruit and all these gleaming materials where God is present, and there's no pain, and there's community and worship. That eschatology is basically that, right? That there is hope for this future reality that you can participate in. But another part of the eschatology is what's real now. And Revelation's answer to what's real now is Rome looks like a monster, a beast. And it's ferocious, and people look at it and say, who can make war and fight against the beast? And Revelation says, the beast is not the ultimate reality that you should give loyalty to here. There's God. God has revealed God's ways in the world through the Lamb. That's what's real. And you can overcome the beast by being faithful to God and the Lamb. So that is eschatology too.
Yeah. It's hard to understand because John uses so many different symbols.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are parts, as you say, discussed as a rhetorical device that are used that that they're overwhelming. The book of Revelation is overwhelming to the senses, and I could just imagine somebody who got their advanced copy and that they're reading it and going, "Whoa, holy shit! Okay, how am I going to talk about this?" And like some rhetorician and who's about to go out on a stage or something, and it's just a lot. But where the end times pastors and writers like Timothy LaHaye and his co-writer, who I'm always forgetting, they're looking at these symbols. What are the major symbols? And you mentioned Rome. You're not talking about the Pope. You're talking about Rome in the 1st century AD.
The emperor and the imperial system.
Right.
So one way to think about it is the basic conflict in most of Revelation is between the Lamb, which is the symbol for Jesus, and the beast or sea monster, which is the symbol for a long chunk that represents Rome. And you can make a chart of the things they have in common. Multiple eyes and heads. They both have mortal wounds, but somehow they're alive. They have sponsors. The Lamb's sponsor is God sitting on the throne. The beast sponsor is identified as the devil. They have followers. Their followers receive marks on their bodies. They receive worship. They enter into combat with each other. I could go on. There are a few more. But you realize that this is really a kind of poetry, doing theology through these symbols.
Mm-hmm.
That the Lamb and the beast are in an absolute conflict. But the difference is the beast lies. The beast exploits. The beast murders. The Lamb has one weapon. It has a sword coming from its mouth, which is to say its weapon is the truth.
Mm.
And that is how the Lamb and its followers conquer, is by adhering to the truth. So these are, wildly different systems. And what Revelation needs to do is look at Rome and its empire, its wealth, and say, that looks fantastic, right? Let's pull the veil off and see what it's really a monster.
And you mentioned, and I had never thought about this before, but the misogyny that is rampant in Revelation and in the symbols that are feminine. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah. And, none of this is my own original insight about stonemasons in Ephesus or about misogyny in Revelation. But Revelation takes a metaphor that's pretty common in the Hebrew prophets of women who are unfaithful are described as being prostitutes or adulteresses. So Revelation uses 4 female symbols. One is a bride about to marry the Lamb. One is a woman about to give birth, right? So virginity, childbirth, motherhood. And 2 are accused of porneia, or sexual misconduct. One is described as a prostitute. And these are the only ways of talking about women that appear in Revelation. Like, there's not another one. So that's an extremely limited way. There's another verse that's really fascinating in chapter 14. It says, the followers of the Lamb did not defile themselves with women. And, defile yourself with women is not exactly a feminine affirming way of thinking about sexual intercourse, but that's Revelation's language. So
right.
There's a lot going on with gender there.
And none of it seems positive towards women as such.
I'm sorry, Desimber.
Oh, I was just going to say, in addition to the way the book of Revelation handles women, one of the things that was interesting in your book that probably would uh, cause a lot of Christians some consternation is your your topic concerning the queer aspect of Revelation. I'm going to just read a passage to you and just ask your thoughts on it. In chapter 7, you say, to date, biblical scholars have contributed manifold queer interpretations, but while pro-gay biblical apologetics have achieved cultural salience, publications oriented toward queer interpretation have not achieved similar impact. Yet, one readily understands the potential benefits that would occur when many readers appreciate the queerness of biblical characters and tropes. The Bible, whatever we mean when we use the term, does not present gender in the neat packages some people assert. Certainly, Revelation does not.
I
That
loved that line, by the way. I loved
yeah,
that line.
Okay.
that would probably give a lot of that would probably give some very bad heartburn and indigestion to a lot of Christians. What would you say? What would you say about that, especially where you say the queer interpretation, some or the queerness of biblical characters? What would you say if somebody was like, "What are you even talking about? There's no such interpretation. There's no such biblical character." How would you respond to the hard pushback that you would
Yeah.
get, that I could only imagine that you would get from that passage there that I just read?
Well, if you're reading the Bible as if you were reading a story you hadn't read before, and David's friend Jonathan dies in battle, and they've swapped clothes, and Jonathan's saved David's life, and David laments Jonathan's death and says, "Your love was greater to me than the love of women." And nobody told you that that couldn't be gay.
Right.
What would you think, right? If you're in the Gospel of John and the disciple Jesus loves is reclining on Jesus' breast, and another disciple whispers in his ear, "Psst, Jesus, I've got a question for Jesus. Would you ask him? Because clearly you're closer to him." You might not draw the conclusion, but you would wonder, right? So when I say there are characters in the Bible, and we could add a few more, that's true. But what I'm trying to do is call attention to, again, this is a very timely thing, this whole cult of quote unquote biblical manhood and womanhood.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Where men have to be a certain kind of way and women have to be a certain kind of way, and you're emphasizing the differences. I grew up, I know Dillon did too, in a culture where manhood meant a certain set of things. And ancient Greco-Roman culture had a certain set of things that would define what made a man manly. One of the things that would define a man as not manly enough would be being shamed in public, like a crucifixion, stripped naked, being penetrated by anything. And the lamb stands with these wounds, having been slaughtered, and still lives. The Son of Man, an image for Jesus in Revelation, has a sash around his breast, not his chest, but in Greek, his breast. So, and there are commentators, one, a dear friend of mine, Lynn Huber, who call attention to these dimensions of Revelation. But what I'm interested in is how my own life has been made better, largely because LGBTQ people have taught me that the way I was trying to live as a man is kind of not possible, and it's certainly not functional. And that's okay. So I think being able to ask these questions of Revelation, call gender into question, You cussed earlier, Dillon, so.
Yeah. We tend to do that on this show. We've kept it pretty clean tonight, actually.
The greatest rock band in history, in my opinion, is Living Color, and they have a song with the line in the chorus, "Everybody's fucked up with their sexuality."
Mm.
And, you know, if we could accept that not as something to fight against, but as something that's part of being human.
Right.
Then, you know, masculine is fine, feminine is fine. They are gifts, live them out, but they're not boxes you have to be constrained by. We would be a much healthier society, wouldn't we?
Oh my goodness, yes. Yeah. I mean, I might not have joined the Marine Corps if I had had that kind of an understanding when I was 18 years old.
The
I
things
might
I
have
did
gone
to
to
myself.
theater school instead.
Yeah, the things we do to ourselves and women do to themselves
Hmm.
in order to fit these artificial things. And of course, we're finding out that these churches that emphasize these differences also tend to cover up when sexual abuse happens.
Right. And there was another report that just came out about the Assemblies of God this week.
Yeah. And I don't rejoice in it.
No, it's just not surprising, and that's the tragic thing.
You tell young men you have to be hyper masculine. You evaluate their girlfriends on how pretty they are, but you tell them, but don't touch them. And then when you finally do marry them and you can touch them, you should be in charge and solve all the problems. I'm just kind of wondering why that doesn't work well.
Yeah. You mentioned that in Revelation, wealth, the disparity of wealth is extremely cut and dry. And in other places in the New Testament, I think David Bentley Hart, in his introduction, he says something to the effect of the New Testament, alarmingly enough, just says that it's not just a moral danger, it is a spiritual danger to accumulate wealth. But a lot of John's rhetoric in Revelation revolves around the fact that the Jesus movement people were living at a below or just barely subsistence level within an empire of opulence. Boy, that sounds a lot like a place where I live today. But what would you have to say about what Revelation can speak to now theologically about the wealth disparity or income disparity or what have you?
Well, part of it is in Revelation, if John is describing these churches, these assemblies accurately, some do have resources and some don't.
Mm-hmm.
So you're right that the ancient world has a very few people who are unimaginably rich, and most people are subsisting or just a little better. Certainly not saving up wealth or retirement accounts. Absolutely. But Revelation has a really sharp critique, not of wealth as wealth, but of wealth gained through exploitation.
Mm.
So what an ancient empire was, or a modern empire for that matter, is you use other people's land and labor to send money back to the imperial center and to the elites. And in Revelation 18, another image for Rome that Revelation uses, mentioned earlier, is the prostitute. And when John sees her, she's wearing expensive garments and jewels. She's got a golden cup. She's opulent. But she gets destroyed in chapter 18. And there's this moment when various groups are lamenting that she's destroyed. But one is people who trade off sea traffic, merchants. And it lists the cargo that she was producing that made them wealthy. Mm-hmm. And it's like gold, silver, pearls, jewels, luxury wood, luxury food, luxury scents, luxury items. And then there are two more, horses and chariots, which are instruments of war in the ancient world. You didn't farm with a horse. And then the final item in the list is slaves, human lives. And This is what the Romans did. They literally transported tens to hundreds of thousands of people enslaved to Rome and other imperial cities, to the degree that 20 to 40% of the population of a city was enslaved.
Right.
And what Revelation is celebrating is that this system that just bleeds dry all of these provinces and the ordinary people in these provinces. There was one emperor who said, I like my sheep sheared, but not shorn. Like, leave them something. But the whole point is to exploit.
Right.
Anyway, what Revelation is doing is condemning that. So, you know, when wealth itself can be spiritually dangerous, I agree. But what we have now is a society in which people are so wealthy they have no accountability to a community other than each other.
Right.
They have no accountability to the people who work for them, and they seem to be determined to drive public policy and decide who gets what. And they seem willing to promote technologies, whether they're good for us or harmful. That's exploitation. And yeah. So, you know, again, this is a question Revelation poses that you won't find in the same way anywhere else in the New Testament. What does it look like when you build a society that way?
Yeah, it sounds almost like an ancient, and it's not. It's an anachronism, but an ancient critique of modern laissez-faire capitalism, because of the way that is about the accumulation of wealth and power at the expense of others. I mentioned a book last week, Edward Baptist, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism, because we were highlighting Joshua Hames, the slavery apologist. And I did not remember that in Revelation 18:13, that there was that apparent condemnation of the enslavement of others, which I think would make that the only condemnation found anywhere in the Bible, if that's what it is. I mean,
it does depend on how you read passages, but there is a reference, I think in 1 Timothy, maybe, I should know this, but I don't, that slaveholders are in a list of people who won't inherit the kingdom of God.
Right.
I'm sorry, slave traders.
Slave traders, yeah. And I've read Dan McClellan's exposition of that, and he's like, that's the kind of people that were snatching free people and then enslaving them, versus the typical ways in which people became enslaved. But that might be,
I'm not sure.
That might be a very narrow point of contention. But one of the things that Revelation is on the surface is brutally violent.
Yes.
And when I took directed study with Lee Barrett on nonviolence and theological nonviolence, he had me read J. Denny Weaver's The Nonviolent Atonement. And Weaver in that book espouses a hermeneutic of nonviolence despite the violent rhetoric in Revelation. And then I read your book today, and that chapter today, where you mentioned, but then Jesus apparently engages in violence himself in Revelation at a certain point. And I don't like it.
No.
I don't like it, because I have that theological lens that Jesus was non-retaliatory, that flipping tables is not what we consider the kind of violence that the empires are doing, and that kind of thing. But Revelation has got a lot of blood and a lot of violence, and you do a really good job of sort of explicating different points of view that scholars have had. And I just would like you to kind of unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah.
Because that it's like that day in class when you said something to the effect of, Jesus never outright condemned slavery, and I really wish he had. and in Revelation, Jesus looks a lot different than he does in the Synoptics or in John.
Yeah. Yeah. I try to be transparent about this, that, there are groups of interpreters who see God and Jesus as being at war and violent.
Mm-hmm.
And there are others who emphasize the nonviolence of the Lamb. In fact, a lot, like J. Denny Weaver, a lot of Anabaptist scholars have made arguments about Revelation. Where I land is, I guess I would say three things. Revelation absolutely does not call the followers of Jesus to take up arms. And we need to remember there had been revolts against the Romans, so it's conceivable. Mm-hmm. Doesn't do that. The Lamb fights, the Lamb gets bloody. The Lamb's weapon, as I mentioned earlier, is a sword coming from its mouth. So how do you interpret that sword? Is it a violent weapon on its own, or is it simply the fact that the truth is disruptive?
Mm-hmm.
So you can read Revelation optimistically, but the third thing is Revelation promotes a desire to see the violence. Mm. There's a moment when the martyrs are in heaven in chapter 6, and they cry out, "How long, O God, until you avenge our blood?" And when people go through the worst plagues you can imagine, and they can't repent, and they're cursing God, and you're reading it and you're thinking, man, this is just about enough. That's when a chorus of heavenly beings will break out in song and, praise to you, O God, and glory, for your judgments are true and right. In other words, to say, no, this is okay. You can watch more blood. So the question of violence in Revelation, I don't think can be neatly resolved. Mm-hmm. But if you take each of those 3 points, you can at least continue to advocate for a nonviolent ethic. Yeah.
Yeah, because that it is a startling way of viewing Jesus as a slain lamb with a bunch of wounds, who then goes into kick-ass mode at a certain point. And it's like, but I read in the other books that the incarnation is this way, and this doesn't line up, and I don't like this Jesus.
Can I tell you what? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
What I read when I was in grad school that still hasn't left me is, I don't know if you're familiar with Alan Bozak. He's a Black anti-apartheid pastor activist in South Africa.
Just from your book.
Yep, I mention him. Anything I write about Revelation, I'm likely to mention him. He was imprisoned and tortured. Mm-hmm. And he wrote about Revelation from that moment. And he has this line, I'm not quoting it just so, but it's close. If Christ's cloak is splattered with blood, it's the blood of his enemies and the oppressors of his children. And what I will say to you, even though I don't like violence or the desire for violence, is if I'm in a room with Alan Bozak, I'm not going to say, you were wrong back then.
Oh, yeah, absolutely not. Right. I mean, yeah.
And I've had the chance actually to meet him, and, I was in a line, and rather than saying, hi, I just quoted the line. He knew immediately, right?
Yeah.
It was a powerful line. I take it to him too when he wrote it.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to the perception of oppression that John is talking about, because historically we know that there wasn't a widespread systemic oppression of the Christian movement, but at least the perception of it. But people like the pastor or the scholar you just mentioned in South Africa, and people like John Lewis who were brutally beaten, and those folks during the civil rights movement or the abolition era. It is not for me to say, as a white person who's never experienced that, but what about?
Right.
And that's the nuance. As much as we would like to see it, or I would like to see things settled non-violently. You don't talk about this in the book at all, but it just kind of struck me that Revelation almost didn't make it into the canon. And if I could go back in history and time and whisper in somebody's ear, Eusebius maybe, and say, maybe let's not include this one. I would do that because of all of it, because it's messy, it's blurry, as you mentioned in the book, and it's discomforting, and it's very black and white. There's no wiggle room for John of Patmos and what he sees as the way forward against empire. And it makes me think of things like today, where there's no ethical consumption in this phase of capitalism, right? Like The Good Place.
There's no way out.
There's no way out, right? You can make choices. I haven't shopped at a Walmart in forever, right? But I still have an Amazon account. My books are on Amazon. What am I supposed to do as an author of with a small publisher, et cetera? And if you start pulling that all apart, the next thing you know, you're living under an underpass somewhere, and that's all you can do. You're like a Brahmin who can't walk because you might kill a microscopic thing. I mean, you can't be human at a certain point, and that's one of the things that makes Revelation so tough.
That's a good insight.
It's really hard because it does promote that very strict binary thinking. But thank goodness for scholars such as yourself, because we can learn a lot, and we can take things that we can appreciate. And I wrote on a notebook, separate the wheat from the chaff. And I can, the next time I choose to read Revelation, I'm going to do that through the lens of, this is an anti-empire critique. This is a critique against the exploitation of intentionally marginalized people and all of those kinds of things, and leave the violence and all of that to go. Dee, did you have any concluding thoughts?
Hopefully my laptop is making some odd noises, so I was hoping I'll see if our editor can't fix that later. My concluding thoughts are just thank you, Dr. Carey, for undertaking the work and the task of rereading Revelation so that you could prompt and encourage us to reread it. Thank you for all the work that you put into this. And thank you for the courage to reevaluate the meaning, interpretation, and manifestation of the book of Revelation. I appreciate it.
Thank you. When you're an author, to have folks read your work with interest and want to talk about it, it's wonderful to be included on your podcast, which is also wonderful. But, I would meet you at a very scuzzy bar to talk about my work, right?
Yeah, right. Oh,
I'd be glad to meet you.
Thank you.
Well, we typically leave the show with the word on the street, and appropriately tonight, I have sometimes it's a theologian, sometimes it's a poet, but tonight it comes from not quite a fever dream on an island in the Mediterranean, but a complex rhetorical work from a difficult time and place. Revelation chapter 21, verses 1-7. And this is the hopeful part that one of our listeners said. Elaine says Revelation gives hope. And I'm glad, Elaine, that you can read hope. And so here's some of that. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them, they will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." Also he said, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true." Then he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water as a gift from the spring of the water of life. Those who conquer will inherit these things, and I will be their God, and they will be my children." The word of the Lord. Thank you, Greg. This is a thought-provoking, sometimes maddening explication of Revelation, because the book itself of Revelation is all of those things. It's queer, it's provoking, it's maddening. And it's not quite as esoteric if you read this book, folks. So pick this book up. You can get it on Amazon, which is not in the book because the beast is not Amazon. It's not capitalism. It's not Soviet Russia. It's the ancient Roman Empire. Greg, thank you so much. Always a pleasure. We need to get together for a beer soon. So let me know.
Yes.
And, like and subscribe and share the podcast, folks. And we'll be back next week with Pennsylvania State Representative Ishmael Waddell Smith, or Smith Waddell. I did that backwards. And we're going to talk about immigration in the Catholic Church next week with Rep. Izzy right here on the God Squad pod. So we will see you next week once again.